Welcome back to Texas in Focus. My guest on the program today is Gabe Fleisher, the creator and author of the newsletter Wake Up to Politics. Gabe, thank you so much for joining the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So let's just start with this. Tell us a little more about Wake Up to Politics. What is it? And tell us about the history behind it.
Yeah, for sure. So Wake Up to Politics is a daily email newsletter that I write myself. I'm a student here at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. I've been writing the newsletter for more than 10 years now, since I was pretty young. It kind of just started as newsletter I sent out to my very first subscriber was my mom, and then to kind of friends and family, and kind of grew from there, and is now about 50,000 subscribers who I reach every weekday morning, just covering national politics, whatever the news is of the day, trying to break it down, make it more accessible to my readers, and just kind of take them behind the scenes of government and politics and try to help them understand what's going on.
And of course, you went a different route to becoming a journalist. You kind of built from the ground up. Usually for people that do things independently, instead of like working your way up at like CNN or a company like that. When people do things independently, maybe sometimes people think they're crazy or don't understand the method to the madness. Tell us about the experience of, building your newsletter to what it is today.
Yeah, I think it definitely is kind of a bit of a non-traditional path. Like you said, I guess I'm a little different, partly because I was interested in getting involved in journalism, just at a younger age where there was no kind of opportunity available to me to work at CNN or, anything like that, just by virtue of the fact I was so young. So that wasn't even really an option. So I think I just went independent, by virtue of that. But I think it has been very beneficial. And I've really appreciated the opportunity. I know my readers appreciate, something I hear a lot from people is, I think when you work for a different news outlet, you automatically, whatever your personal, whatever your viewpoint might be, your lack of viewpoint or reputation, whatever, you're automatically kind of subsumed by the reputation of the place that you're working for. And there's a lot of assumptions and things that go along with that. Something I hear from my readers all the time is how much they appreciate, they know when they're reading me, it's just me, it's Gabe. They've gotten to know me. They trust me. They feel that they're getting kind of unbiased, objective news coverage versus from a different outlet. They might feel, even if a certain writer they might trust or might feel is objective, they feel, is kind of maybe sullied, if we could use that word, by kind of the broader reputation of the news outlet. So I think that's something people appreciate. I think it allows me to I'm completely independent, it's completely ad-free, no sponsors. It's just kind of, people know it's just me, it's what I think. And I think in some ways it's been beneficial to me. It's given me kind of these years of working on the newsletter, with, letting the audience grow, very organically. And I just feel I've gotten better and better and better, without, any kind of corporate pressures or pressures from anywhere else for what I'm doing, just kind of has allowed me to grow and improve as a writer, and for my audience to grow along with that, and kind of let me kind of get better and better at the craft, just by kind of working independently, kind of off to the side of kind of the rest of the media ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And one more about Wake Up to Politics. I've heard you on panels or in some of the what would you call it, the the interviews, the scrums with the different members of Congress, and it definitely sounds like you belong there, despite being like decades younger in some cases and some of like the people next to you. I wonder, did it take you a while? I know writing is probably your thing, but did it take you a while to kind of develop your voice where you're on panels or you're asking questions of important people? Was that a process for you, or did that always come easy?
No, it was definitely a process, and I appreciate you saying that. That it sounds like I feel like I belong, because I don't always feel that way, or I don't always feel that way automatically. So no, definitely a process. Definitely, something that takes years. That is still will take even more years. It can be very intimidating to be in spaces like that, like you're talking about, with scrums with candidates. So I've been in, presidential debate spin rooms, with candidates, or on Capitol Hill interviewing senators, congressmen, all sorts of these scenarios. And as you say, generally either the youngest or one of the youngest people there. And that can take time. And, there's certainly like an imposter syndrome that goes along with that. Like, do I really deserve to be here? Do I belong here? And yeah, I think it's just taken time. I think by now, because I've been doing it so long, I've gained some experience and some comfort. At this point, a lot of other, generally in spaces like that, a lot of the other journalists know me, familiar with me. Sometimes the politicians are as well. So I think that has helped. And I think it's something that comes with time. Kind of the more you do something, like in anything, the more comfortable you become, the more you realize, okay, I can do this. I do belong here. You sometimes, especially in like scrums like that, sometimes you might hear someone like ask a question you were going to ask, and at first that can be kind of frustrating, because then you have to scramble and come up with a different question. But then things like that can also be kind of affirming, because the more you kind of spend time and things like that, you listen like, okay, like I know what I'm doing. Everyone's asking questions, maybe sometimes asking questions that I also wanted to ask, kind of affirms that you're going along the right way, and you might you're not totally out there, and kind of what you're wanting to talk about, what you're thinking about. So I think it's certainly a process, and not a complete process, but it's good to hear that at least I've made some progress.
I think I could ask like 15 more questions on that front, but let's move on to some of what you cover. If somebody won last week's debate, who do you think it was?
I mean, I think it's hard to say. I think the most obvious answer, the answer that's been given a lot, and I think I would agree with, is probably the person who wasn't there was the winner, and that's Donald Trump. Just because I don't think anybody, I think, we can talk about, and I'm sure we will, different candidates. I think there were certainly interesting moments, interesting performances, and people who definitely were compelling on stage. I think all of those candidates on stage, they're 40 points down. They're like, they're in very serious, in dire straits, with all of their campaigns. So, what they needed to win was kind of a huge breakout moment that really clearly catapulted them ahead of the rest of the field and ahead of Donald Trump. And I don't think any of them had that. And so just by virtue of that, I think Donald Trump won. And just, I think there was no evidence that any of them were ready to kind of take him on, to get ahead of him, to show to the Republican, this was their first and potentially best opportunity to show to the Republican electorate why they deserve to be the nominee, not Donald Trump. I don't think any of them made the case effectively enough to be called the winner of the debate.
And my follow up to that was going to be who was the loser, but it kind of sounds like you're saying all of them were the loser in a way.
A little bit. I mean, I think there's some of them who had kind of more, the debate was more important to them than others. So I think, yes, in some ways, I'd say all of them. I think particularly Ron DeSantis and Tim Scott are the two candidates I would say that had the most to gain from the debate. And just by virtue of, we haven't seen really yet any kind of major, reliable, trustworthy polling yet. So maybe this could all be wrong. But from my viewing of the debate, it didn't seem like either of them really stuck out really at all. It didn't seem like either of them, DeSantis or Scott, really wanted to speak that much. They were pretty quiet. They had they kind of pretty low total in terms of speaking time. Whereas other candidates like Mike Pence and Vivek Ramaswamy kind of continually seemed to like want to speak, want the stage, wanted to kind of have that breakout moment. Both DeSantis and Scott, it felt to me like kind of were hanging back, and kind of not necessarily afraid to speak, but just hesitant to kind of put themselves out there. And I think both of them, there was a lot riding on this debate. There was a lot of expectations for both of them going into the debate. There's a lot of donor expectations for them going into the debate. And kind of neither of them were really even a factor. And even in the case of DeSantis, didn't seem like the other candidates viewed him as much of a factor, because at least his own campaign was kind of hyping up that like they would all be, they'd all be attacking him, and it would be his kind of opportunity to kind of fend off all these attacks from all sides. And then none of them really cared about him, and none of them really kind of took him on at any point. So I think, again, it's hard to say winner or loser, because it's not like either of them had this like moment that was like, oh my gosh, they did so terribly, or they like kind of fell flat at a very obvious point. But neither of them stuck out, and I think they really needed to in order to kind of close the kind of enormous, and historically, very large polling deficit they're facing against Trump.
And that follows in perfectly to my next question. Your reporting this morning was about President Trump's legal troubles. Have Republicans basically resigned themselves to the fact that he's going to be their nominee, indictments and all?
I mean, I think some haven't clearly. I mean, clearly the 8 people are on the stage the other night. I think they haven't. I mean, and look, and anything can happen. And I think, as I wrote about this morning, and since that, we've learned the trial date that Judge Tanya Chutkan has set, or at least, it's subject to change, but at least for now, which is the day before Super Tuesday. So you can kind of see how these kind of legal and political timelines are going to intersect in really, I mean, unprecedented, obviously, but kind of very interesting ways. And so, I obviously anything can happen, but I think, and I guess the other thing I would say is I think most Republicans, it's not that they've resigned themselves, it's that is what they want. I mean, you have at this point in most polls, it's about 60%. It's edging towards 60% of Republicans who want Donald Trump to be the nominee. They all know he's been indicted 4 times. Most of the times that he's been indicted, his polling has only increased. His fundraising has increased. I think he raised $7.1 million was the number after the mugshot was released last week. So, I think to talk about it, obviously, there's different types of Republicans, and there's some for whom I think there's some who don't want it and are resigned to it. There's some who don't want it and are still kind of convincing themselves, kind of practicing, as some journalists have talked about, this kind of magical thinking that it won't happen. But I think kind of when you talk about the Republican Party, the biggest group is people who are not resigned to it, who are excited by that, who want him to be the nominee. Many of whom want him to be the nominee even more because of the legal troubles that he's facing, because that kind of has solidified his support even more. So I think resigned to it, when you're talking at least about the majority of the Republican Party, is not even the right language. It's this is who they want, and it's who they're most excited for, and that could change, but kind of every indication we've had after every indictment so far has been it's only pushed at least a majority of the Republican base closer and closer to the former president.
And let's walk across the aisle. How do Democrats feel about Joe Biden's reelection chances? Are they confident, or what's happening there? I know you wrote about Dean Phillips last week. So how are they feeling about Biden's reelection chances?
Yeah, I think I don't know that many Democrats are ready to sign on to a Phillips campaign. And now, even since I interviewed him, like you said, a few weeks ago, and it seems even since then, even in my interview, I was struck by how, compared to some of the coverage, it seemed like he was not really prepared to actually run himself. And I think since then we've heard even more from him that suggests to me that I don't think he will run, or at least that's not what his thinking is right now. But kind of the points you were making was he was pointing to the polling, and the polling points pretty clearly that Democrats are not that thrilled about Joe Biden being their nominee. I think numbers have gotten a little bit better for him, since he's announced, since kind of the reality has set in for a lot of Democrats that he's kind of their only option. Phillips is kind of the one Democrat talking, maybe, Gretchen Whitmer, or maybe, Josh Shapiro, maybe someone else will run, but clearly no one else has. And I think that's kind of set in for a lot of Democrats. But at least, a few months ago, that as recently as a few months ago, and still a lot of the polling shows this now, you're looking at like about half the party who don't want Biden to be the nominee. And when you look at key demographics, I've done a lot of reporting on young voters. Look at young Democrats, it's even higher. You're looking at 60-70% of young Democrats, and sometimes of other Democratic groups too, who don't want Biden to be their nominee. So I think there's a lot of hesitation about Biden. Obviously he's the oldest president in history. I think that has a lot to do with it. I think there's a lot of hesitation. Doesn't mean those Democrats won't end up voting for Biden, but that he isn't necessarily their number one choice as the nominee. And to kind of the other half of your question, I think there's a lot of trepidation. There's a lot of fear. I mean, obviously he won in 2020, but it was a razor-thin election. And I think most people's expectation, and certainly mine, is that 2024 will be a razor-thin election again. Whichever person ends up slightly on top, it's hard to say, but whoever does, it will be only slightly. And so I think, and that's actually something that is interesting in polling. If you look, Republicans seem a lot more confident, thinking there's no way that Joe Biden could win re-election, whereas Democrats seem a lot more hesitant in their own chances, kind of recognizing, this could really go either way, which is what I think, is that it could go either way. That, let's say it is Biden or Trump, they both bring with them, pretty gaping vulnerabilities, but then also strengths that would bring to them, that would make it a pretty close race. And I think you see a lot of Democrats who, I just think, Dean Phillips, in my interview with him, he kind of cited, the morning after the 2016 election. I think for a lot of Democrats, that's like just this trauma they will almost never get past, and that they still think of, that kind of turned politics on its head for them, and that they think, after that, anything could happen. And I think very few of them are confident that Biden could win. Maybe even less confident than they should be. If you look at the polls, if you look at the economic numbers, not that he's kind of a shoo-in, but I think he certainly has a shot. And I think there's a lot of Democrats that almost kind of refuse to let themselves get to that point.
Mm-hmm. And we're 14 months out, about 6 months out from the start of primaries, 14 months out from election day, in November. Are we at the point where we shouldn't expect Congress to get anything major done before then, or is everybody already in their battle stations, and we'll be lucky if we avoid government shutdowns, but really shouldn't expect anything else from Congress until after election day?
I mean, potentially. I mean, I think you mentioned government shutdowns. And so, in terms of getting stuff done, in terms of like kind of big picture items, or like big kind of agenda items for either party, maybe not. But, there are some pretty serious must pass items. So, that is kind of what I think a lot of the congressional focus will be on. September 30th is the deadline that we have that Congress needs to fund the government by. There's certainly a lot of expectation in Washington. They might miss that and we might go into a shutdown. At the very least, I mean, it's certain if they don't, the only other option will be a continuing resolution. There's really no shot that they'll have a budget by then. Really only a month from now, and they're both on recess, and they've been on recess for a few more weeks. It will be for the next week. So best case scenario, we're looking at a continuing resolution, maybe pushing us down to December or somewhere like that. So definitely that is going to be to just funding the government, and kind of these budget battles will be kind of the main thing on the congressional agenda. So I guess to your point, that's not nothing, but maybe it's not it's nothing kind of. I mean, it's important, but it's not transformative, nothing new. It's just kind of the routine thing that they have to do every year. Chuck Schumer he has talked a lot about things that he wants to get done when the Senate gets back. He says he has a long to-do list. I covered a speech a few weeks ago that he gave on AI. He wants to, he's kind of planning a new big AI bill, which would be very interesting. He was a big mover behind the CHIPS bill that passed last year, and he wants to do another kind of big kind of bill aimed at kind of competitiveness with China. That's something he's been working on with other Republicans. Marijuana, the Safe Banking Act is another big priority of his, kind of allowing banks to work with marijuana companies. So he has a fairly long to-do list of kind of bipartisan items. I think, yeah, to your point, there's a lot of skepticism in Washington whether any of them will get passed. But there's also been a lot of skepticism in Washington about anything bipartisan getting passed the last 2 years. And Schumer particularly has kind of busted those expectations a few times. So I think it's not impossible. But the idea of, and then the other thing I should mention is the supplemental funding request that the White House has put out. They're looking for Ukraine funding and more disaster aid funding. That's also something that's going to be a huge uphill battle, with the Republican-led House. And with the fact the House is going to be very distracted by investigations that we might see in a few weeks, an impeachment investigation launch, which is again not a legislative item, but something else that will take up a lot of Congress's time. So I don't think Congress will be out of the picture completely, but there's certainly not a lot of hope for any huge legislative pushes. But also there's certainly a lot of irons in the fire and a lot of things that are possible, but the main focus is going to be appropriations for the foreseeable future.
And as we start to wrap this up, is that an actual possibility, a thing that's more than a possibility, a thing that's going to happen, this impeachment inquiry?
I think it's certainly a possibility that one will be launched. Whether that means an actual vote to impeachment happens is hard to say. I think Kevin McCarthy is right now under a lot of pressure from obviously the right wing of his caucus to launch an impeachment investigation. There's also certainly a pocket of Republicans who are very skeptical of that, who think that would hurt them in their districts, kind of more battleground Republicans. At almost every juncture in the McCarthy speakership, when you've had kind of moderate Republicans on one side and kind of Freedom Caucus Republicans on the other who have wanted different things, I think there's not been a point yet. Maybe the resolution of the debt ceiling is maybe an exception, but at almost every point, the Freedom Caucus has gotten their way. At the very least, he's kind of bent over backwards to make them very happy with the resolution. And so I think that should give you a hint of what's going to happen next with this. It was very interesting to me in an interview this weekend, him kind of tying government funding to the impeachment. And he kind of said in an interview, McCarthy, that he's trying to make the case to his right flank that they should keep the government open, which a lot of them are skeptical of. He said that's the only way we can keep the impeachment investigation going. So you almost see him kind of linking that as this way to try to convince the Freedom Caucus not to kind of spark a shutdown fight, which he's trying to avoid. But it kind of also suggests maybe to do that, he's going to have to throw them a bone, which would be opening an impeachment inquiry. So I think that is absolutely something that is more than possible, that he has, each of his comments so far kind of been inching closer and closer to, and it's definitely a possibility we could be seeing in the coming weeks.
And I'll close with this. As we enter debate season and that makes way for primary season, is there going to be maybe one storyline that you're keeping an eye on as we enter into the primaries here in a few months?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the biggest storyline is the one we've talked about. It's just this kind of intersection between the former president's legal battles and the political timeline, this kind of unprecedented collision of a front runner for a presidential nomination, both trying to doing at one hand what is something very traditional, which we expect, which is going to different early states and campaigning, being in Iowa, New Hampshire, and then the Super Tuesday states, kind of trying to rack up votes, and then on the other hand, in 4 separate jurisdictions, sitting potentially for trials at the same time, at the same time as some of those primaries and caucuses, and trying to defend his innocence. Obviously that is such an unprecedented kind of collision to be happening. So to have those two at the same time, I think that's kind of the major storyline. And then off to the side, kind of, I guess, the third thing that we talked about too, which is whether any of his Republican rivals can kind of use that, or use anything else to try to make the case to Republican voters that they, not him, deserve to be the Republican nominee. None of them, I don't think, were able to do that in the debate last week. So I guess the other storyline would just be them trying to kind of stumble towards a message maybe, or hope that he kind of just collapses under his own weight due to these legal troubles, which I don't think is really a possibility or really going to happen. So, it's that is, to me, just kind of the storyline. It is kind of watching, this kind of, former president both try to fend off legal troubles and fend off, these kind of challenges to become the Republican nominee now for the third election in a row.
And with that, that's Gabe Fleisher, creator and author of the Wake Up to Politics newsletter. Gabe, thank you so much for joining the program.
Thanks so much.